Wow. It's been messy, but in a great way. I love presenting at conferences mainly because I love to hear everybody else speaking instead of my own voice. And I've been excited to hear just the little nuances already where we've been talking about sound. Mona talking about the opportunity to maybe think about how we can sonify data. We're going to talk about bias in voices, a little bit that Mary Ann touched on a little bit. AI. Later on, you'll be hearing some things about mental health, about sleep, about oxytocin. That's all connected to sound. And so what we want to do for you today, Tom and I, is to take you on a little journey, give you a little bit of insight into the power of sound, maybe a few little sound hacks that you can use in your own life, reveal some first-of-its-kind research that nobody has ever seen or heard until today. If we do our jobs right, you'll go through the rest of this day and hopefully maybe even the weekend listening to the world around you a little bit differently. So, with that said, let's get started talking a little bit about audio alchemy. So, what is audio alchemy? The easiest way I've found to describe it is to say it's the process of taking a little bit of sound science, blending that with sound art, and if you do it correctly, you end up with a little bit of sound magic. Now, I think of alchemy in the Jungian sense of alchemy, which was really about a transformative process, and part of that process for Jung was chaos, and that was where creativity lived. So this idea of messiness is at the heart of audio alchemy. And then, as a sonic strategist, which when I'm introduced, people hear that term, and they say, great title, but what the hell do you do? It's just a little bit of a variation on that idea. It's still this blend of sound science and sound art, but we use it in such a way to try and help folks make sound decisions, quite literally and figuratively. So let's dive into that a little bit. And before we get started, just want to give you a little piece of research that is a little heartening and disheartening at the same time. So this was a piece of research that was done by Ipsos using 2,000 different television commercials. They went through these commercials and they took a look at all of the distinctive assets that brands were using in these commercials. Now, not unsurprisingly to me, 92% of the assets that they cataloged were visual in nature. You have logos, colors, characters, celebrities. They also cataloged sonic brand cues. Some of you may know those as sonic logos, brand themes, consistent uses of music that could be used as a brand device. 8%. So, in all of these advertisements, sound got only 8%. But the interesting thing in Ipsos' study was they took a look at brand salience. So they were actually looking at the effectiveness of these campaigns and tying it to the use of these distinctive sonic assets. And certainly, visuals had an impact. It was always interesting to me to note that characters far outperformed logos as a distinctive asset. But look at the power of sound here. When they analyzed all their data, they found that at the end of the day, advertisements that were using sonic brand cues were almost 8.5 times more likely to produce the brand salience and the effectiveness that the advertisers were looking for. So this says to me that while sound is hugely powerful, it's still undervalued. So one of the things that I want you to do today as you're listening to everyone speaking is thinking about how sound is kind of a part of a common thread that's woven through all of this, and that maybe in the noise, that's a little bit of the signal that we can find. So the fascinating thing to me is, as I've done this research and done this work, is to find all the different ways that science addresses sound. We have psychoacoustics, which is basically the physical properties of sound and how it affects the world around us. I most recently dove into psychoacoustics with some research that I did with Kellogg's, where I played hip-hop to cheese as it aged for 6 months to see if I could change the molecular structure of the cheese. You actually can, because it's affecting the microorganisms as they're developing, and that changes the aroma and the flavor of the cheese. And then Kellogg's turned that into some sonically aged Cheez-It, sold it online, and in 2 weeks sold out the boxes. I think you can still get some available on eBay today. So psychoacoustics is one of the areas of science that we look at in sound. The other is psychophysics. Psychophysics takes a look at our sensory input and how we make sense of the world around us through those senses. We're going to talk about that a little bit more specifically in a moment. Sonic semiotics, the way that sound produces an awareness of symbols and can actually change narratives. We've been able to change the way that commercials are perceived and the narrative underneath of those commercials simply by changing the soundtrack. And we're able to change where people are looking on the screen. We're able to change how they're interpreting the action that's happening, all through these sonic semiotics. There's also ethnomusicology, where we kind of look at the cultural aspects of sound, the way people use sound in their lives. And then music cognition, which is essentially kind of looking at the psychological sciences and how music and psychology work in our lives. So I want to talk about three things specifically today before I turn it over to Tom here. And to do that, I want to give you a quick introduction to a little bit of music theory. So these are all the music building blocks of sound: pitch, tempo, dynamics, harmony, modality, timbre, and articulation. So when we talk about pitch, we're really talking about something that's high or something that's low. We talk about tempo. We can talk about fast or slowing it down. When we talk about dynamics, we can talk about something that's loud or soft. Harmony, consonant or dissonant. Modality, something that's major or minor. Timbre, something that's bright or dull. That's instrumentation, very often changes those. And the last one is articulation, something that is staccato, the notes are all separate, or legato, the notes woven together. So try and think about those things. We're going to tap into that as I go through these sections with you. So let's talk about emotion at the beginning. There are a lot of theories around emotions and how emotions work. The one that I want to share with you this morning is from a researcher by the name of Russell. Russell took a look at arousal, how high or low arousal is, and compared that with valence, positive and negative, or how much we're attracted to something or repelled by something. And in building this model, he was able to kind of look at a series of emotions that were correlated somewhere in this axis between arousal and valence. Using this and these musical building blocks, we can start thinking about how to target emotions with sound. So if we have something that's high in pitch, fast in tempo, we're getting up to something that's very excited and alert. Let's drop that tempo just a little bit, but still keep the pitch fairly high. That's a little more happy, fun. Now let's drop the pitch and definitely drop the tempo. Let's move away from staccato notes into more legato notes. Starting to feel maybe a little more relaxed out of that. Now if we build in some minor keys, kind of move to the other side of valence, now maybe this is a bit more melancholy. We might even say sad. If we stay on this side of valence, but we up the dissonance and up the tempo, then we're moving into sounds that might make us feel a little more tense or nervous or uncomfortable. So knowing how we can use these building blocks of sound, we do this very naturally all the time. Think about the playlists that you may have built. I call these things sonic tonics. They're a way for us to look at our emotions, our moods, our mental states, and use music and sound in a very positive way. Think about when you're getting up in the morning. My suggestion for you is that you don't use a really loud alarm to shock your system, because when your brain first wakes up, you're in a fight or flight mode, and that loudness can give you a jolt of adrenaline and that cortisol that's not exactly healthy for you. But if you have a particular piece of music that you like and that you enjoy, that can bring you out of sleep in a much more positive way than an alarm. You can use these playlists to kind of lean into emotions and moods. One of the things, if you're feeling down and melancholy, this might be counterintuitive, but you may want to actually lean into that, because the research shows us that what happens is when we're listening to sad music, that can have really a positive effect. It actually creates more of a sense of empathy for us. And if you want to focus, try using music that has a very static tempo, maybe 80 to 100 BPM. Your brain starts to entrain with that static tempo. The tempo that's a little bit higher gets those cognitive processes working a little bit more, and try to avoid things with lyrics. These are all sonic tonics that we can use. And an interesting study that Apple did was worked with Sonos, used 109 folks in 30 different homes, had them put on wearables, they had eye beacons, they had cameras tracking movement, and took a look at what happened in homes in a period where there was no music being listened to another period where there was music. And they found that in homes after the music was there, the physical distance between individuals decreased by up to 12%. People were 15% more likely to laugh, 18% more likely to say, "I love you." And they found that a lot of folks spent 37% more time in bed. We know what that means. And so finally, before I leave this section on emotion, I just thought I'd mention, I think automotive manufacturers who've always been attuned to sound and the way that sound produces a relationship with a vehicle are really leaning more into sound in electric vehicles as they begin to think about that point in time when we are going to have self-driving vehicles. And it's no longer just for transportation, but vehicles can be spaces for entertainment, for health and wellness, and also for work. And so Mercedes has done some really interesting things in hiring an acoustician to develop some soundscapes for relaxation, for focus, for energy. They're working on ways that they can use the wearables to actually kind of understand your stress levels, if you're awake, if you're getting drowsy, and be able to use AI to generate music soundscapes. You stop for a 10-minute charge, they've got a soundscape for that relaxes you at the beginning, and then at the end of the 10 minutes starts picking the energy level back up. And another interesting sonic intervention is the use of pink noise. They use a burst of pink noise if the car senses that you're about to crash, and that pink noise triggers what's called a stapedius reflex. It kind of separates the eardrum from the inner ear bones and prepares you for what is more likely going to be loud noises as a result of that crash, and it mitigates potential hearing damage. So I think it's fascinating to see how automobile manufacturers are really leaning into sound and emotion in a much more interesting way. Now let's talk a little bit about perception. As we talked some about emotion, let's talk about perception. I've done a lot of work with Charles Spence, who heads up the Cross-Modal Research Laboratory at Oxford, and we've worked with Charles on understanding this idea of sonic seasonings. We use a cross-modal principle called Buba Kiki. Now, some of you may be familiar with this. You see these designs. One of these designs is a Buba, and one is a Kiki. Which is which? What do you think is the Buba? Shout it out. Yes, exactly. And how did you know that? Did we study that in school? What the researchers have found is that our brains are wired for congruency, so we're just looking for the ways that things fit. We look at those round edges, maybe we're looking at the roundness of the letters, maybe we're thinking that booba sounds a little softer in our mouth, whereas kiki is a little harsher, a little sharper, fits that diagram. Now what if I were to say to you, would you like a chocolate that tastes booba or a chocolate that tastes kiki? Now your brain is starting to work with congruency between those sounds and those flavors. And indeed, we found that if we take our sonic seasonings, we can tease out flavors. We can actually prime the brain and change your perception of flavor using these sonic seasonings. This particular sonic seasoning, tasting a piece of chocolate, you might tend to taste that chocolate as being a little more bitter. If we change those sonic seasonings a little bit, this is the sonic seasonings for sweetness. We can actually increase your perception of sweetness of that chocolate. We've been able to tease out sonic seasonings for salt and for sour. This one just kind of makes my teeth hurt when I hear it. And we've used this research in a lot of different ways with a lot of different brands. Worked with Propel once to take their energy drink, which has salt and sweetness, and putting those two things together with the sonic soundscapes. Consumers were able to move a fader on an app we built called Flavor DJ, and the Propel would taste a little more salty or a little more sweet. We've used this in healthcare, thinking about nutrition, thinking about the fact that in loud environments you tend to consume more. So here's a little sonic diet tip for you: wear earplugs when you eat. The research shows you can consume up to 30% less calories as a result. And now let's talk a little bit about bias before I turn it over to Tom to bring the research up. We've been doing a lot of thinking about how we hear voices in particular and biases that may exist there. Very fascinating article recently in the New Yorker looking at what they call the sensory of shrill, and that women were vastly employed as sound operators. And then with the advent of radio and attempting to move over to become radio announcers, found that often their voices were described as shrill, as harsh, as distorted. That really had nothing to do with the women's voices. It had everything to do with the fact that men were building technology based on certain regulations and only thinking about lower-pitched voices. And as a result, women's voices just didn't sound that great. You couldn't hear the consonants and the articulation. And not only that, but the male engineers just assumed that female voices would be softer, so in cranking up the volume, it distorted. So what were women left to do? Tried to adapt to a male voice with a lower pitch, with a certain type of articulation. We found this exists in AI assistants even now. Think about the voices that we hear coming from our AI assistants. They're typically white and female, which is problematic on two fronts. And not only the voices that we hear, but also how people speak to AI. And we found that across all of the platforms, the error rate for voices of color is much higher than the error rate for white voices. So it's almost as if the technology is saying, I would understand you better if you could sound a little more white. And as a result of this, we've launched an initiative called Stand for Sonic Diversity. You can go to standforsonicdiversity.com to find out more of this and how we're choosing voiceovers in our commercials and what we can do to build more sonic diversity into that. So now I want to turn it over to Tom to talk a little bit about an experiment we did looking at AI voices, because now AI is all the rage. Can you tell if an AI voice is human? Can you tell if an AI voice is coming from a synthesized source? And what do we need to think about as we think about the data sets and the training and the voices that we hear. So Tom, turn.
Thank you very much, Steve. Yeah. So, thank you, Steve. Yeah, so I think Steve's demonstrated admirably how a sort of stronger understanding of the science can actually provide creative inspiration for more, well, for cooking up more creative, emotionally charged sonic solutions. The question is, can we actually understand the degree to which those sonic solutions are hitting the right notes and striking the right chords with the intended audience? Fortunately, there's been an evolution too in the ability for science-based methodologies to measure the things that really matter when it comes to sonic effectiveness. And a lot of these focus very much around the power of our non-conscious and an understanding that our subconscious is incredibly powerful and influential in shaping our perception of sound, to the point where we have a mantra, which is, if it works at the non-conscious level, we should be measuring sound at that same level. So things like content and source and context all can help cue biases, all have a role in shaping perception. So yes, cueing unconscious biases, evoking emotions, shaping perceptions, triggering behavior. And all of these things are worth measuring, and measuring at that deeper level. But at the same time, there's a kind of recognition that a reliance solely on traditional research, self-report methods, for example, like focus groups and quant surveys, can only take us so far, and in some cases can lead us astray. So there are different ways of measuring sound using non-conscious. One route is through labs, which we started doing in the early noughties, adapting techniques from the clinical medical world like EEG and fMRI and GSR. These things are fascinating, incredibly valuable and insightful. But being lab-based, they do have some challenges in terms of budget, and they have some challenges in terms of timelines and things like that. And they tend to be used for bigger ticket items, for more strategic projects, and for more kind of R&D type work, not for the kind of day-to-day work we're going to be spending time talking about today. It was really the advent of cloud-based technology and the introduction of platforms which were loaded with implicit type metrics, which brought the possibilities of measuring sound into the fore, in a different way into the fore. And of course, platform-based work allows us, because of the sort of agility and scalability and affordability, it's much more in tune, if you like, with the fast-moving demands of the commercial world. Take our Sonic Reactor platform as an example. It's loaded with an array of implicit testing tools that allow us to uncover hidden biases and associations, feelings, values, benefits, and actions and intents. How are these things used in the creative world and the research world today? Well, increasingly now with creative agencies and client side, we're seeing not just evaluation of sonic solutions, but the actual creative optimization too, and right the way through the process. So in a sort of iterative test and learn kind of way. So we might be testing at exploration stage different sonic palettes and different sonic territories. At the other end, we might be testing in the studio the final mix and blending of something that's going on air tomorrow. Who uses this stuff and what kind of disciplines are they from? Well, of course, those involved in the fast-growing field of distinctive assets and sonic branding, this is a natural home for this kind of work. Sound design, for example, ambience creation or experiential work, music of all descriptions, and of course, voice, which Steve has just alluded to. So what we want to do now is to share with you a study, absolutely hot off the press. We've only done this work a couple of weeks ago in the US. We wanted to look at a number of things, and so we recorded a whole bunch of radio scripts, half of them AI and half of them human. We looked at different genders and cultures, contexts, categories, and brands. And we had sort of three primary areas that we wanted to explore with you today. Number one was, at a non-conscious level, do we respond differently to AI versus human voices? And if we do, what does that actually look like? So we're going to have a look at that. And then the third question was really about something that Steve alluded to, is can we actually tell the difference between these days between AI and human voices? So we put that to the test as well. So let's have a look at the overall shape of AI voices against human voices. We've used here a metric which we're calling implicit attraction, which is a kind of approach-withdrawal kind of measure for the psychologists amongst us. What did we find? Did we detect a difference? Yes, we did. Not just a difference, but a statistically significant difference. With the AI voices sort of 24% lower, or human voices 24% higher, in terms of their attraction. We have split attraction down into two metrics, positive and trust. Those two measures are very important in terms of triggering approach withdrawal mechanisms and also helping to shape things like first impressions, which I'll talk about in a minute. But you can see again from the slide there, very healthy, boosted, statistically significant scores for human against AI on both those dimensions. This is really quite interesting because the implicit attraction kind of mechanism works incredibly quickly. So within milliseconds of that exposure to the voice for the first time, the brain will kind of create a kind of a sense of attraction or rejection, in a sense, or withdrawal. And that initial kind of impression tends to act as a filter for what then follows. In this case, it's a radio ad. So you could say that from a human versus AI point of view, the humans have a kind of unfair advantage in the sense that they are more attractive to begin with, and they seem to be picking up good vibrations and resonating good vibrations in a way that is likely to induce, likely to aid the communication as opposed to hinder the communication. But what happens if we completely change the context? What happens if we tell people that what they're listening to is actually an AI voice, even though it might be a human voice? And in this particular condition here, on the left you see people, we split the sample in half, who were listening to human voices but weren't told anything. And on the right, the people who were told that this is an AI voice. What you can see is quite an alarming collapse in terms of trust. 27% reduction, and a small compression, if you like, in terms of positivity. Obviously quite a worrisome thing in a way. We all know how important trust is to brands, particularly these days, and how difficult it is to earn it and how easy it is to lose it. So it's a kind of real watch out for those who, the very notion of people believing a voice might be AI or being told it is, can actually have quite a kind of negative impact. So turning back to, we're looking also, did the same thing happen with AI voices? Well, you can see from the chart, not really any effect there. Tell people it's AI, they're listening to AI, you can see the trust levels are around the same, a slight drop off in positivity, true, but nothing like the same impact that we had with human voices. So, going back to the question about whether we as humans can consciously tell the difference, spot the difference between an AI voice and a human voice, we found that a slim majority, around about 60% of people, were confident enough to claim that they could tell the difference. The question is, can they? We found it was no better than the toss of a coin. When put to the test, people thought they could tell the difference, they actually couldn't. And one could make an assumption that this may get worse in the future, may get tougher in the future, and we're going to be looking at different categories where things might be rather different in certain kind of contexts and certain kind of situations, like healthcare and finance, for example, rather than maybe more mundane things. But you might think that you can do better than that, and we'd like to challenge you to do that. So either through the QR code, through the URL, the URL, or come and visit us over in the picnic area at our stand, and you can run the test there. We'll be collating all your responses and then feeding them back to Nudgestockies over the coming weeks. So, this was just, as we said, just the scratching of the surface and was really hot off the press. A bit messy in that regard, I'm afraid. But in terms of what's lying ahead, we've got further work to do and to publish on gender biases, cultural biases, contextual biases, and we'll be reporting with Steve a paper in due course. Steve, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. So, again, just to wrap up, think about what you're hearing today. Think about the potential that sound has to be used in your own work, in interventions, whether it's in your personal life, in your communities, in your businesses. Think about how you can research, test, and measure. And I wanted to leave you with this, because I'm a huge Miles Davis fan. And when somebody asked Miles about how he plays and how he was able to play so well, he said, "Don't play what's there, play what's not there." And a lot of times when we're pursuing data, we can get so focused on the data, so focused on the signal, if you will, that we lose some of the benefits of finding some things in the other noise around it. So when it comes to the data, it's not just about playing what's there, it's about playing what's not there. So thanks for your time, and I hope you hear the world a little differently today.